Good evening, everyone. Hi. Bonjour. Welcome to the French Institute. I'm Clémence Rebourg, and I've created the Women Shaping the World Festival, which is the festival in which this event is inscribed. I'm delighted to have you all here. Most of you I've never seen, and I'm very excited to welcome at the Institute. Just before I pass it on to Anna Picard from Opéra Holland Park, I'd just say a couple of words about how this event came to be, because it's been a long and fruitful partnership with Opéra Holland Park for years and years. So Opéra Holland Park initially contacted the Institute to hire our rooms, including this one, to do patrons events. And through this, we got to form a bond, which was partly friendship, partly kinship on achieving the same objective of bringing culture to London, being in West London as well. And so through this relationship we developed, we decided to do something together that would go beyond a private hire on their part or a public event on ours. So when I started thinking of developing the festival, I wanted to do something on feminism and opera. And being French, I wanted it to be on Carmen. Not being myself particularly versed in the art of opera, I only know a few, and one of them is obviously Carmen. So I contacted Laima and Anna saying, hey, would you like to do an event on feminism and opera? And I'd like to do Carmen. And it happened that this year, Opéra Holland Park is programming Carmen in June. So everything fell right into place. Not like in opera where everything goes completely crazy. No, it went really well. And so we built this event like this, and I'm delighted that from a initially commercial relationship, we went on to build a much more fruitful and cultural relationship. So thank you so much for being here. You've been given handouts with a description of the event and the bio of our wonderful guests tonight, but there is also a QR code on the top left, which will lead you to a survey. I know surveys can be a bit fastidious, but they are really helpful for us to understand who comes, especially to the festival, because it's the first edition. So if you have 5 minutes to fill it, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much, and here is Anna Picard.
Thank you very much, Clémence. I'm just going to go over what we put in the preamble on the leaflets that you've had, just in case anybody hasn't picked one up. Feminist thinking on opera began in France with the publication of the philosopher Catherine Clément's Opéra ou la défaite des femmes in 1979. Almost a quarter of a century later, the first treatise to examine opera through a feminist lens remains provocative. It's been criticised for its focus on the text rather than the music of works that at least force an audience to listen to the voices of female characters who would otherwise be silenced or dismissed. In the wake of the Me Too movement and many other dramatic events, many of the questions raised by Catherine Clément still resonate. Practitioners and critics of an art form that's regularly described as fundamentally misogynistic or voyeuristic have to find new ways of understanding old stories, many of which end with the death of the heroine. Clément called Carmen the most feminist, the most stubborn of these dead women. One of the most frequently performed and enduringly popular operas across the globe, Carmen has become a nexus for contemporary concerns around the representation of female characters. Should we think about cancelling Carmen? She's not only othered by her gypsy heritage in the text and the music, she's lawless, she's sexually confident, she's sharp-tongued, she's witty, she's self-contained, and uncommonly direct in the communication of her own desires and values. Yet, even today, her murder at the hands of her ex-lover Don José at the end of the opera is romanticised as a crime of passion. In this panel discussion, we're going to be looking at the history of Bizet's opera and its many adaptations. I'm going to ask if it's time to reassess what we know about Carmen. With me this evening, Dr. Claire Lozier, cultural historian and co-editor of a wonderful book called Carmen Revisitée. Eric Giel, critic for The Guardian and deputy editor of Opera magazine. And I think Erica has probably seen more Carmens than most people have had hot tapas. Cecilia Stinton, who will be directing Carmen at Opera Holland Park this summer. Sonia Ben Santamaria is here, and she is the associate conductor, but tonight she's going to be playing for a woman we are very grateful to have tonight, stepping in for Kezia Bianek, and a wonderful Carmen herself, mezzo-soprano Claire Presland. As those of you who've seen Il Segreto di Susanna or The Bear will know, she's also an outrageously talented comedienne, which is surely one of the facets of Carmen. Would you mind coming up and singing the Habanera? Carmen's Manifesto. Thank you very much. That was, yes, irresistible. Claire, can I come to you first on this? I wasn't going to ask this question first of all, but it occurred to me listening to that song. What are we talking about when we're talking about love?
It's deep, big question. I suppose Miriam doesn't give a definition of love at all. Carmen herself doesn't really explain what she means by love. So as readers or as listeners, we are required to guess or project what we understand by that. So of course there is a heavy sexual dimension in the novella, in the opera. There is a dimension of play, I would say, as well, with this constant changing between I love, you love, I love. And so love is a game, yes. love is something that's difficult to maintain. I suppose in the sense of Carmen, she's going to be punished because she's not faithful, because she's constantly exploring love. She's constantly having new love partners, new lovers. So I suppose for her, love, it's a sort of exploration. It's an open field to perhaps know yourself and know the other. And she refuses that to be bound to one single experience.
So it could be desire, it could be sexual desire. We're not talking about conventional romantic love, though, are we?
In her case, no. She's not Manon, she's not Massenet. No, she's indeed much more adventurous than that, yeah.
I'm pleased that you mentioned Manon and Massenet. We were talking a little bit earlier about the Prosper Mérimée book. Could you tell everybody a little bit about the Mérimée, the basis for the opera?
Yeah, so it's a very short text. It's 10 pages long, so you can really read it in 1 hour, a couple of hours. It's much less developed than the opera itself. So Bizet and his librettist really developed the story by adding characters, adding scenes. So the Mérimée storyline is quite straightforward. You have Carmen, you have Don José. He falls in love with her. We don't really know whether she falls in love with him or not, but she kind of leads him. Mérimée published this novella in installments in newspapers in France in 1845, that was. And then 2 years later as a novella, as a book. It was not an instant hit in the way that Bizet opera was, but it was, let's say, known enough, famous enough, so that Bizet, a few decades later, picked it up and developed it into an opera. Of course, it's part of the development of Romanticism in France, and also part of this interest into Orientalism and this fashion for everything Spanish, everything Southern in Romantic mid-19th century Europe.
How French is it? How Spanish is it? We know that Don José comes from the Basque region.
So the border, precisely. So I guess Carmen is on the border. She's a bit 50-50. I mean, she's the most Spanish of, I suppose, heroines, but she's also very French. So as the story goes, she is supposed to be based on a very specific French Parisian type called the grisette, which was, let's say, the working girl in the Montmartre neighborhoods who was selling her charms for a bit more money. And this character became a kind of statement of some sort of literature of the 19th century. And then Mérimée turned that into this Orientalistic tale by adapting it to the Andalusian setting. So the character itself was known, was recognizable, but the novelty here is that she becomes even more other. She's female, she's a bit of lower origins, and she becomes foreign, so she becomes even more this unfathomable character that everybody wants to catch and can't really.
So 1840s for the novello. That just occurred to me that's the same period that the scenes from the Latin Quarter that we have, that we get the grisette, Mimi and Musetta as well. It's really quite interesting. So 1875, it's an opera. It's not a smash hit instantly. It is something of a flop. It's first performed in the Opéra Comique, which is normally quite sentimental works are performed there. You don't have suddenly have a stabbed gypsy on the stage at the end. You're supposed to have a happy ending and an appropriate wedding. Erica, you've seen lots of Carmens. Does she resonate with you? Do you find her believable? And do you find her funny?
Yes, I sometimes find her funny. I don't think I find her believable. And I think that as I get older and as I see more Carmens, I find her less and less believable. Or maybe it's that we're being told the wrong story. I wonder if the interesting bit of Carmen's story is what has happened to make her the character who can sing that habanera, and not what happens afterwards, where she becomes, I feel, a kind of a cipher for someone else's story entirely. She doesn't really develop much as a character. She's presented, and then for some reason she chooses Don José, who is the most unpromising person on the stage, this awful man with a mother fixation, and then he destroys her. But when she comes on and sings that song, she's interesting. She's how is she this character in an opera written by men in 1875, thank you. And she's so sort of unusual in that way, but after that she becomes less and less interesting, I think, and productions try and make her more realistic and more relatable, and it doesn't always work, although I'm sure...
I was just about to say, Erica, you've thrown down so many gauntlets there. I think we need to let Cecilia respond, or alternatively, we'll get Claire back to sort of fight her corner as well. Cecilia.
Okay, I'm on. Wonderful. Gosh, this has already become so fascinating. I think the question you raise, Erica, about the preamble to Carmen, and actually what's happened before to produce this woman who then can sing the habanera, is really pertinent and really fascinating. And we could perhaps almost say the same for Don José, in that, you know, in some of the dialogue which some productions cut, we get a bit of an overshare about who he is and where he's from and what's led him to move to the other side of Spain to become a military man. And I think what's interesting about this question of a preamble for both of these characters' storylines is if we can present one, is it possible to stage one? That's one of the joys of being a director and being able to stage the music sometimes, to have that wiggle room to think about ways of framing the text and the music in those spaces, whether it's the overture or elsewhere, intermezzos. And so what has Carmen done before, but what's Don José done before? And therefore, what are the stakes? What are the stakes of Don José being in the army? Why does he have to make that work? Why does it matter? Why is he so insistent when he hears that offstage bugle that he's got to go and he can't stay with Carmen, even though he's totally enchanted by her? In a way, I think presenting these stakes for Don José is a slightly more straightforward task, perhaps, in that he has got into a bit of trouble at home and had a fight with another man and possibly killed him, and has had to flee and start a new life. And there are stakes there for him, I think. For Carmen, it's less clear, but something I always wonder, I don't know whether you have, Claire and Erica and Anna, but why is Carmen working in a tobacco factory? I mean, what's led her there? It's the ultimate proletarian job, but she's also got, as we're told in the text, a heritage which is not necessarily to do with staying in one place. So these are all very intriguing things, that need to be teased out.
The tobacco factory itself, I mean, what I'm interested in is what Bizet and the librettists supply us with even before we see Carmen. And I'm not talking about the bits that, it can be cut, the dialogue versus the recitative, such a thorny issue. The music and the text suggest a closed-off area of extraordinary voluptuous exoticism. Everything is setting up sex. I can't remember who it is who asks, I think it's Zuniga, why don't any men go into the factory? Oh, it's because the women don't the women don't wear all their clothes, you know. It's hot in there. It's a cigar factory. We all know that cigars, well, at least in myth, are supposed to be, you know, rubbed on one's naked thighs. So this is the setup even before, you know, she comes on. Now, another point I just wanted to throw in. One source I read said that Don José, his family wanted him to become a priest. Which really doesn't bear thinking about. But yes, there's all this sex, and then even before the factory girls come out, there's this little pantomime of sexual infidelity, two passers-by and a third one who is presumed to be the lover. I mean, it's not subtle dramaturgy, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the setting of the cigar factory is like a hammam almost. You have all this kind of oriental imaginary being developed, and we indeed imagine all these half-naked women in this very hot room. And so, yeah, it adds to the attraction of the character, of the opera itself, of the novella. And then what you do is this indic setting. Do you have that on stage? Yeah, of course, it's down to the creation, the new opera you put on stage each time. So either you emphasize that or not. And I guess that's what's beautiful with the opera. It's not set like the text. You can precisely do what you want with it. And therefore Carmen become a new Carmen each time.
I wonder, Erica, if the disconnect that you feel is because there's a degree to which Carmen is always performing. I mean, she doesn't actually just divulge much of herself, does she?
Yeah, I think that's true. I was thinking about what we hear from her, and that the habanera is very much a performance. It is even in the opera, isn't it?
Yes.
Isn't it? She's got the last production I saw was at Opera North a few months ago, and there they set the whole thing not in a cigarette factory but in a nightclub full of, well, a strip club basically, and for the habanera, Carmen came down on a swing from the flies and was surrounded by sort of ostrich feathers. Like, so if you wanted to signal that this is a performance, you couldn't have done it more so. But I think the aria after within the card game is kind of the only time she sings for herself to us, and for some reason I never feel that's her strongest moment. It's never, he hasn't given her most memorable music and her most memorable scene for me at the moment that she's revealing anything of herself to us, the audience. So she's still at this sort of, I still have that disconnect from her, if you like.
Well, I suppose, I mean, her name, it's Latin for charm, it's not Latin for spell, isn't it, Claire? And for singing. Claire, do you want to expand on that at all?
So yeah, the word Carmen comes from charm having two meanings, either a spell or singing. So of course she's named well on that regard. So of course Mérimée probably didn't think of that in the first place because he wrote a novella and not an opera, but that was really indeed nicely done for Bizet to have this heroine, this character who wore this name that was so suited for his purpose. So she does a bit of witchcraft, she catches spells on men, and yeah, she has this aura of a witch in some way, and she definitely also, I suppose, is blamed for that and has to pay for that because she has this power that is unknown, is difficult to control, and that's part of her character as this scary woman with all this power.
I wonder if now would be a good time to... No, Sonia, you want to add something?
I'll sit next to you. Hi. I very much agree with Erica, although Carmen is my favorite female character in the operatic world. But I think if you look at it from a music point of view, which obviously that's my thing, she starts with the habanera, right? And that's the rhythm, yeah, bam, 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 bam. And that rocking of the habanera, that is basically the translation from the Spanish people having to go to Cuba, and through going to Cuba, having to suddenly set their life there. And they picked up the habanera. But they're not from Cuba, they're from Spain, but they're still in Cuba, but it's Spain. And I think the fact that Carmen sings that first, she's telling us, she's stuck. To me, she is stuck. And she's stayed stuck all through the opera. Stuck for many reasons. I don't know. I'm not as clever as those ladies. But, she's stuck with what people want from her. She sees that, she gives it. That's her freedom. But at the same time, she's imprisoned. But she's stuck. And the only time is at the end of the opera, the only time she has, because after that you have Les Remparts de Séville, which is quite dry and staccato like the habanera, but for the card scene, you've got legato for the first time. And she knows she's dying, and she's ready. And that's where you get her for real, I think. So,
I think this is a good cue to hear the card song. with death. Listening to that, it occurred to me just how much death there is all around the story, and also all around Seville, and the sort of the fetishization, almost, all the uniforms. You know, Clémence is wearing a lovely gesture tonight to the Matador's costume. But, you know, there's this decoration, but I keep thinking about those religious processions that you have around Easter time, all these saints, effigies everywhere. Cecilia, how do you, when you started thinking about how you were going to tackle Carmen, how much of it was sort of visual? Because to me that music is incredibly visually suggestive.
Where to begin? I mean, I think if we use as a starting point this idea of visualizations of death, first let's go with narrative before music. So we have these sort of homosocial spaces set up, so the all-male environment of the soldiering space. So on stage we see lots of uniforms, this strong visual sense of a shared pursuit, profession, characteristics, expectations, assumptions. Then we have the factory space, which is an all-female space, and it was the 19th century, but there is a sense of thinking about the production line. Sonia's really brilliant point about being stuck, I think, is so important. Both in the military and in a factory space, we have these visual emblems of repetition and, in labor or routine. And then we have Escamillo, and we have the world of bullfighting. Again, death is deeply embedded there, and also these sorts of kind of gaudy colours and decorations that also have a kind of affinity with some of the bling of Catholicism. But that's also a kind of uniform, and and with this uniform comes hierarchy and what kind of role you have as part of the bullfighting team. And I think there's something very Bizet already, we're already given through Mérimée and Bizet, we're given these sorts of structures, and we meet José, who needs structure in some way and performs well in structure. It's a sort of security blanket. And Carmen, we see also in a structure, in a factory space, and it drives her to despair. And I think there's something deeply visual about that when you're seeing all of these bodies on stage with chorus members, etc. It packs a real visual punch. That point is made visually. And we can see strongly the way in which Carmen suffers, I think. As for the music, it's hard to know where to begin, and I defer to my musical colleagues as well. But I suppose that's how I started thinking about these kind of the numbers of bodies on stage and the kind of social spaces that are being envisioned.
Thank you. There's a sort of Dionysiac quality also to the aria at the top of Act 2 in Les Pastiers as well. I think it says she collapses from exhaustion because the music is getting faster and faster and faster. Are you coming round to it a bit now, Erica?
I came round to the card song just then. Well, yes. I mean, Carmen is an amazing opera. There is hit after hit after hit after hit song, and yet I don't want to feel unsupportive to Cecilia, but it can seem ever so long on stage. There is something about the story about how she is stuck. You root for Carmen so much, but she doesn't get her happy ending. She makes one bad choice, or maybe two bad choices. One, Don Jose, and two, staying outside the bull ring. Go into the bull ring with Escamillo, who... Yes, and all will be well. But maybe it's Catherine Clément's point. She is too free and must be punished for it. So that's what audiences then expected, and that's what, to some extent, they still expect now.
I'm not sure that anybody was expecting Carmen in 1875, but I think you're right. And the other thing that was occurring to me while I was listening to Claire sing is what an experience it would be to go to Carmen for the first time without having ever heard it, without knowing the story. And, I don't even remember when I learned the story. Do you?
I think I do, yeah.
Oh, please tell us about that.
I love Carmen in the first place because it's a bit of a funny story. I used to perform it myself with my little brother when we were kids at my grandparents every summer, and we would put on a show. We would dress up with my grandmother's colorful dresses and plastic jewelries, and we would do Carmen, so with the songs. And my brother and I were Carmen because we are not interested at all in Don José. And yeah, that was like the childhood memory I have, and she was it all. I mean, Don José didn't exist. We just cared about her because, the songs is so great. Her character is so powerful, and even for kids, she was, total catch.
And flash forward a couple of decades, and you're editing this volume of. Please talk about the book a little bit, and maybe we can pressure an English publisher to publish a translation.
Because it's published in French. Actually, funnily enough, I dedicated the book to my brother after all these shows we put on every summer. So it's a book that comes from a conference I co-organized with a friend who works in Madrid, in the university there. So she's Spanish, I'm French, and we wanted to do something together. And so what is half French, half Spanish? Ta-da, Carmen. So we did this conference 2016, I remember. That was the day of Brexit, so I remember that very well. We were in Madrid doing that. So we invited specialists of the text itself, Mérimée, Bizet, the opera, people also who spoke about contemporary adaptations of Carmen. So that's what interested us, how she is revisited today, how she is adapted to contemporary culture. So for instance, films that reference her, contemporary artists that reference her. For instance, Stromae, the pop Belgian singer, who did a song called Carmen. So that's what we wanted to explore and see how topical she still is and what she means to us nowadays.
She's not going away, is she?
No.
I mean,
she keeps coming back.
Yeah, she keeps coming back.
She's not dead.
She's changing. We were talking a little bit earlier about how you characterize her behavior, and we all, I think, despite ourselves, keep falling back on this idea that she behaves like a man. But does she behave like a man? Is it just that we lack the vocabulary for a different description? I mean, we've had Samantha Jones in Sex and the City, who had the very good sense to move to London and not take part in whatever that awful nonsense was that followed up. But pictures of sort of... It seems as though she's punished for her libido. Libido and liberty, yes.
That's the problem, right?
Cecilia?
I think one thing that's interesting, though, in the way we sometimes present Carmen relative to other male operatic characters, like Don Giovanni, for example, is often a comparison that is sometimes made. But I think what's interesting is the sort of Don Juan, Don Giovanni archetype is is a libertine who has simultaneous lovers, whereas, and I don't know, I mean, it is of course up for grabs depending on how you wish to present the story, but as far as the opera at least tells us, Carmen has sequential lovers. They don't overlap necessarily, and so she reserves the right to have the freedom to choose and to change her mind, but she's ultimately going about her relationships in not quite the same way as Don Giovanni, I feel. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Oh no, I completely agree. I think it's really. I think we need to get away from this idea of this seduction. I think we need to get away from the idea of slut shaming.
But what is slut? What does that mean? You know?
Yeah,
I guess it's
exactly.
the same as okay, she behaves like a man. What does that behaving like a man means? Depends on what we put behind those words and perhaps the wrong things.
How much of that is actually in the text? I'm trying to think.
You know, when we announced that we were doing this, I went back to the text. She is very, very plain and clear about what she thinks. She's honest, apart from the little lie about coming from Navarra. But I mean, no, she makes a point. She says, Carmen never lies, and nothing she does is unreasonable.
But is it in? I'm trying to think whether it's in the text that she's at all driven by her own desire for sex, or
well, we heard that
her own desire for
Carbonara.
freedom. But
she also uses a charm for money, but because she has to. She has to make a living, and that's working at a tobacco factory was not enough. Didn't last long, so I guess that's what also make her problematic in the eye of the public.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about the opera is that, and the story is that it speaks to questions not just of gender, but also of race and of class as well. I mean, if we think about the soldiering, we think about the bullfighters, we think about Carmen in the tobacco factory. None of these people come from particularly privileged or wealthy backgrounds. All of these people are struggling to get by. Both the army and bullfighting is, it's a mode of social mobility for young men. In that period, it would have been. But you read about these bullfighters who kind of didn't necessarily come from bullfighting families, but they jumped into the ring one day and tried their luck, and they had success, and they made it big, and they earned phenomenal amounts of money. And so I think there's something there that's, I suppose this question, I've been thinking so much about gender and Carmen as a woman, but I also sometimes think that her Romany heritage and also the questions of class, I'm coming back to them again and again too, because they of course all interact ultimately.
It's a precarity, isn't it? Her life's precarious. She's just got to sort of live from, one paycheck to the next. I just want to ask, what do you think we're doing, all of us actually, by returning to these stories over and over again? Is it sort of, Erica, is it a sort of a ritual, do you think, almost?
I don't know. Maybe there are only a few stories. I remember a director I interviewed once telling me there are only 8 stories in the world, or something. He said, and one of them's Romeo and Juliet, and one of them's Cinderella, and maybe one of those is Carmen. But as I said, I'm not sure I believe it. I think the music, actually, I think the music is what does it for this particular opera. The story is fascinating, even if it doesn't always work.
Maybe it's fascinating because it could be anybody, it could be anywhere. It could be now, it could be then.
Yes, yeah.
Cecilia, what do you think? Why do we return to familiar works?
This is something I've been thinking about for a really, really long time, and I keep coming back to the thinking of someone called Ernst Bloch, who was a German Marxist thinker. Don't panic, everyone. But he wrote about Wagner, he wrote about lots of things, but he was interested in the possibility of rescuing Wagner through, in his words, surrealistic colportage. And by this, he was making a case for critically revisiting works which present problems. And he was a great advocate of an extraordinary opera house in Germany that was very short-lived called the Krolloper, that sort of flowered in the Weimar period with very arresting productions. So I think this idea of kind of critically rethinking, critically rescuing in some way, maybe not rescuing, maybe rescuing is slightly the wrong word, but I think there is something about revisiting old works that somehow is a mirror, a useful mirror, a productive mirror that helps us reflect on where we are as a society and what we're doing. And I think there is always, you don't need to stage Carmen with a contemporary mise en scène to feel the sort of contemporariness of her situation. And I think I so feel what Erica is saying about Carmen as a character and some of the barriers one feels that she puts up almost, and the things that make it a challenge to identify with her as a human, as a woman, perhaps. But I think what's interesting is thinking around the narrative and what I do, thinking about mise en scène and staging, and thinking about the conditions which put pressure onto these characters and inform their decision-making. And that's something that mise en scène can help to do. And the way we do it tells us so much about who we are as a society now, I suppose.
Claire, would you like to say anything about this from your experience of having performed the role? Yeah? Come on.
First of all, I'd like to tell you a little story. When the second Carmen I did, I was so chuffed, because it is a mezzo's or soprano's dream of singing this role. And I did an interview, and there I was, all young and excited, and the guy interviewing me said, "How do you feel about playing Carmen?" And I said, "Amazing, I'm so excited." And he was like, "Oh, yeah, it's just, everyone's got an idea of what they think Carmen is in their minds. So before you've walked on the stage, before you've sung the habanera, they have an idea of what they want you to be, and chances are you might not be that." And I was like, great, feeling really good about it now. But I've thought about it a lot, and he's absolutely right. And I wonder whether that's part of the challenge, that we do have an idea of what we think she is, but it's very hard to articulate, and it's very hard to put into a box or mould of any sort. We just know that it challenges us in some ways. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you for those. Thank you. That's fair. I'm now feeling really defensive of Carmen. I'm thinking, why should she be likeable? Why should she be appealing to our sympathy? Why should she be revealing more about herself than she actually wants to at any point? Claire, what do you think about changed endings? There are two that are mentioned in your book.
So I thought about that again last night, I think. Yeah, precisely. Asking myself this question. And so there are basically, the novella on the one hand and the opera on the other. The novella, you can't change the end. It's written, right? It's not set in stone, it's set in paper, but you're not going to rewrite Mérimée. Bizet, on the other hand, you can create it each time you stage it. So the opera, because it's asks to be reinvented, to be reinterpreted each time, you can precisely change the end. So I think it's what the opera allows, and so I think it's personally a good thing to do. But you can also not change it if you wish. But that's at least what the opera allows you to do, and you should seize this opportunity, this freedom. Personally, also again, as an artist, to precisely explore this possibility it gives you.
But you mentioned specifically the production in Florence.
Yeah.
where she ends up taking up the gun.
Yeah. So yeah, there was a production 3 years ago in Florence by a director called Leo Mascolo, so a man actually, and they decided to change the ending. So José tries to kill Carmen with his knife, but she actually takes his gun and shoots him in self-defense, right? That was not at all well received. There were lots of critics for having dared to touch Bizet opera, Mérimée text. There was even an hashtag created for that, Carmen Gate. People wanting to boycott the opera, the performance. And it was indeed short-lived and not a massive success in the end. And it was also criticized because it was done by a man, among other things. So a male director surfing on the popularity of the Me Too movement as a way of making his piece appealing to the public. And so, yeah, that was sadly not perhaps what we would have liked to see. I mean, yeah, I think we can change Carmen and she can, it's possible, yeah, that we rewrite it in another way.
I want to know whether the critics were male or female.
Mostly male, I guess, in this world. I mean, it's great to have a female critic, actually. They exist, of course. But sadly, yeah, mostly male critics were not happy with the endings. Yeah.
Erica, did you see Theodora? No. Okay. I heard somebody say I did. Good. Okay. There was a recent production of Theodora by Handel at the Royal Opera House. Did you see it? Cecilia's seen it too. It was very much billed as a feminist take on it, and it wasn't just that the ending changed. It was also that there were interferences, I suppose, or disruptions earlier on in terms of in Thomas Morell's original libretto, Theodora, a virgin martyr, is threatened with being put into the imperial brothel, I suppose. But in this, she was very clearly in the imperial brothel. And then takes up a gun at the end. Cecilia, what did you think of that? And what did you? And Erica, I want to know what you made of the reception of it.
I'm a great admirer of Katie Mitchell's work, and there are lots of elements of the production that really excited me. Rather than speaking of kind of the ending or the sort of violence, I suppose one thing that I found myself really reflecting upon during the performance was the kind of representation of two pole dancers who kind of feature in part of the brothel, which I felt very divided about in a way, because at one level they were creating this world very vividly. The kind of balletic movement around the poles was kind of incredibly visually arresting and kind of synchronized with Handel's music in a very particular way, which was kind of exciting and alluring. The pole dancers themselves were wearing very, very, very little, and I felt in the time, gosh, Cecilia, why are you being such a prude? What is this? But there were people around me taking pictures with their iPhones during the performance of these women, and it did not, to me in the moment, it didn't feel like an empowering thing. Even though there is a strong argument for imaging gritty reality and also thinking about the sort of empowering nature of that kind of performance as well. But for me in that moment, it left me feeling not particularly empowered as a woman.
I was not aware of anybody taking pictures when I was there. That's appalling, actually. That feels really transgressive.
It just didn't feel, it just, if we live, and I think, it's addressed brilliantly in the critique, Susan McClary's critique of Clément is, really speaks to this kind of, what do we do? How do we present the feminine on stage? And do we just present these kinds of things to all female audiences where we feel in a kind of safe space, or not necessarily all female audiences, but in a kind of a closed space? How do we grapple with these things? But for me, that was an element of the production that I felt didn't quite work in that moment.
I suppose what I'm interested in is whether it is a feminist act or a feminist decision as a director to put the gun in the hand of the heroine. Does that really right the wrong, or are we being more faithful to reality by simply presenting, Theodora dies for her belief, Carmen is killed by her ex-lover. Erica, in your position as deputy editor of Opera, you must be seeing this stuff, all of these reviews coming in. You must, even if you've not actually been to something, you must be aware of, you can sniff something in the air. How is the community coping with the whole Me Too thing?
It varies country by country. I think here in the UK, it's more that productions like this have like that, and Katie Mitchell's Lucia di Lammermoor, it made me think of that. Looking back, a few years ago, there was a Salome at ENO by Adina Jacobs, where she just had more agency than normal. And the Barry Koski production of Carmen. I don't know how many people saw that at the Royal Opera. I think achieved a position of being a feminist production of Carmen by not really being a production of Carmen, by deconstructing the whole thing, presenting it as something very, very artificial, very detached, and having you're talking about who is Carmen when she comes in for the habanera, and they're always going to have an idea of who she is. Well, in this production, she comes on in a gorilla suit and takes the head off the suit and sings the habanera, and I don't know, maybe just me, but I felt like standing up and cheering. But yeah, critically, I think there does tend to be, to some extent, a divide between male and female critics, possibly purely because the female critics are feeling all these things as a bit of a breath of fresh air, whereas the male critics are not so aware that the fresh air needs to be breathed into it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, what I've noticed is an increasing timidity on the part of the male critics to actually be critical of anything that has been dressed up as feminist.
Yeah. Yes, you can't say anything these days.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, no, you can't say anything. You can't say anything. We're getting very, very close to sort of wrapping up. I wonder, actually, if it would be good to sort of throw open to the floor if anybody has any particular questions. You two okay sharing there? Yeah. If anybody would like... Oh.
I'd quite like to just return to the question of why are these stories coming back time and time again? And for me, I'm a teacher, so I'm used to projecting my voice. Yes. For me, it's the music. And it's the operas that come round again and again and again, where the music is sublime. And, Eugen Onegin, saw that at Garsington recently, Carmen, Traviata, all these operas that have just got the most magnificent music. People love the music. And when you go to the opera, yes, it's the story, and yes, it's the costumes and the staging and the lighting and everything else, but it's the music, which is, for me, central. And everyone wants to hear the music. Everyone loves a great tune. And it was true of sort of 18th century audiences going and hearing Mozart piano concertos and hearing the rondo coming back, a great tune. Oh, there it is again. It draws you in. Yeah, that's my feeling.
I would agree with that. I mean, it's an incredibly sort of vibrant, really sort of scintillating score. Anybody else? Hello.
I was really glad that you brought up that performance of Lucia at the Royal Opera. So I really want to ask you whether you think it is really a feminist reinterpretation, because for what I saw, they make Lucia free and have agency, but the way that she has agency is by being more sexualized than your general Lucia. And to me, it just seemed that it's still playing in this whole narrative of the only way in which women in opera can be free is by being hypersexualized, and then they need to be punished for it, which kind of is what they did with Lucia. So I just would like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I wonder what else could have been presented as a way of visually showing her agency. So, it had to be, or these things had to be kind of presented in dumb show almost, didn't they? Because the music he wrote and the scenes he wrote while these other things were going on are concentrating on the men in the story. It was just that we saw more of Lucia than normal. So maybe what we saw had to be something that was acted in dumb show, and that is something that you can convey. I don't know, but I think you have that's a very good point.
I would say it was also again it was notable for the violence. She was much more violent in her rejection of, is it Edgardo? Normanno? I don't know. The chap that she's forced to marry, and it was a difficult murder. It was a really difficult murder. It took two of them to do it, which was a very, very interesting thing in itself. I don't mind dumb show because I think it can be quite an interesting sort of counterpoint, like in the same way that I thought that the pole dancers were very, very interesting counterpoint to the string figures. Anybody else?
Hello. Sorry, I'll come to you next. First of all, thank you. It's been brilliant to get your insights. I wonder, we've been talking about Carmen the opera, and we've been talking about Carmen the character, but I wonder whether, with the idea of Carmen being a cipher, whether the other female characters in Carmen actually lend more to this and their reactions and their guidance to Carmen herself.
Stephen, do you mean... No, he's not a plant, he works with us.
Promise.
Do you mean Frasquita and Mercedes?
And Michaela as well.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, Cecilia, do you want to take that?
I think that's a really brilliant question. It's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. We're not given an enormous amount of information about Mercedes and Frasquita, but they're very significant in sort of the important reappearance of them before Carmen, before the final scene in Carmen's death, and the warning that they give her, which she chooses not to take. The question of Michaela is also totally fascinating. I think it's important to say that Michaela and the character of Escamillo don't feature in the Mérimée. So these are operatic additions, these two characters. And returning again to Sonia's being stuck question, which I think is really on point, we have, Escamillo, who is this kind of a stereotypical virile bullfighter, although with the added, to my mind at least, quite gender fluid costume that these bullfighters wear. And Michaela, is a kind of sits in some kind of can feel like she sits in a kind of stereotype of the sort of the virgin part of the virgin whore dichotomy, of which Carmen is indicated otherwise, stereotypically. And I suppose what's fascinating about the opera is that we're given these two characters because they inhabit these more traditional positions within how we conceive of gender, in order for us to actually, in my mind, see the kind of crisis that Carmen, but also the crisis that José has, I think, in the fact that neither of them inhabit their own, these spaces particularly comfortably. Both of them, I think, are quite transgressive figures in some ways, both through the text and the inflections of their music. And so I think Michaela's role, there's a world in which we can look at it as a way in which she's presented to us in counterpoint to Carmen, and we understand Carmen perhaps in a more nuanced way through who Michaela is, whoever she is. I think that's one thing I've been thinking a lot about. But the question of who these other characters, other female characters are, and what they bear witness to, I think is really important, yeah.
Anybody else? Hello.
Oh, I'm glad that Michaela's been brought up, because in the reading that I've had about Carmen, she's always presented as being from the Basque country, and is very blonde and wears a blue skirt. She stands out immediately, and therefore is immediately attracted, or she's attractive to the soldiers when she makes her first appearance. I can't help feeling that because, in theory, because Don José is also a Basque, perhaps he should be blonde as well, and therefore he is very different to the general run of Spaniards in Seville, which might mean that he becomes attractive to Carmen because he stands out. Initially, he's not interested in her, but she suddenly sees a blonde head in the crowd. Fantastic, something different.
In Mérimée, it's very clear, José is a blonde, tall, blue-eyed guy. It's not at all what you have in mind, indeed, when you think about the opera. You think all these dark-haired Spanish man, but actually, yeah, he's indeed this totally different-looking man. Yeah.
And could I possibly take up the point you made about we always go to Carmen with an image in our mind of what she looks like? And a number of years ago, Christa Ludwig was invited by the Royal Opera House to appear in whatever production she wanted. They put it on specially for her, and the dear lady chose Carmen. And I'm afraid, to my mind, she was totally unsuitable. She looked like a German Hausfrau dressing up. I mean, the voice wasn't the problem, but it's just her appearance. And I'm afraid it didn't work at all. Perhaps I'm being very chauvinist and very nasty, but it didn't work for me at all. Thank you.
I wonder whether that was her fault. I mean, I wasn't there. But talking about playing Carmen, it made me think about. I interviewed Christopher Purvis once, and he was talking about acting, how you could learn to act. You can learn to act anything, but you don't act the king. That's one role you don't act, because everyone else around you acts you are the king. You don't have to do anything. And maybe with Carmen...
That's a very, very good point. Yeah, but your point makes me think back to the Anne-Sophie Vonotta, Carmen and Glyndebourne back in it's probably about 15 years ago, the blonde Nordic Carmen, and, everybody was like, oh, this doesn't work. Go back and look at the DVD now, and you sort of think, well, actually, that's really sexy. What she's doing. French is impeccable. She's really, really sexy. So, yeah, it doesn't all have to be, cleavage and... I think
I guess I have a question, and I'm going to go against the ethos of the event that I programmed, so it's kind of problematic. But going back to your point of the Royal Opera's production, which I adored, I went to see it 3 times, is there a way to produce and program Carmen that it wouldn't be gendered? And is it the way out, in the sense that can we escape the gender dynamics in Carmen in what way, or are they so inscribed in the story that we have to go through them?
I don't know. I think it could be worth trying. I don't know whether that show should have been called Carmen or marketed as Carmen, because in any production you have to bear in mind that there's going to be a chunk of people in your audience who are coming to this for the very, very first time. And I don't know how well that show will have worked for them. It should be tried, I think. What do you think? Well, can I pass this to a director?
So could you just elaborate? So when you're talking about the sort of the gender dynamics of the opera, do you mean actually sort of switching roles around? Would that be your kind of radical version?
I mean, gender binding is one way to do it, but just like, I don't know, yeah, maybe being gender blind, I think that's how you say, or just less sexualized Carmen, you know, everything slightly less emphasized on it, because ultimately either we sexualize Carmen, and that's one way to do it, either we don't at all, and that's another way. Like, ultimately we always come back to this. So.
I think it's so interesting, because the question you're sort of, what you're probing is this question of sort of allure, right? And what is desirable to someone in this figure, you know, and we obviously project onto the object of our desire, you know, it's a two-way street. But I think Carmen, Anna said at the beginning, which made me very happy, Carmen is a comedian. You know, Carmen is funny, she's witty, she's smart, she's stuck in this factory. You know, I suppose there are ways of thinking about the music which, you know, immediately does seem to have this very libidinous kind of quality, but actually there are ways of working with, but also against the music, that can reveal a Carmen who's smart and bored. Or, you know, I think this, and so many people have brought this up, and I think it's fascinating, this idea that we sort of, you know, for a woman to have agency in opera, she has to have an enormous sexual appetite, and that's her sort of priority, and that's how she gains agency. And of course, that doesn't necessarily map onto what I understand as my experience as a woman, or my friends, or whatever. And I think, in thinking about Carmen as a person, I think about my own friends, actually, and how they behave, and what Erica was saying at the beginning about, you know, actually, how old is Carmen? Because that will hugely inform how she behaves and how she's playing with boundaries and learning about how to be as a human. I mean, just, you know, listening, but watching Claire sing is just, there's so much detail there that, I mean, I'm not going to really know who Carmen is until I start working with Kezia, right? Because that's, I mean, we haven't really talked about it this evening, but that is so much part of what happens in a rehearsal room. You are so closely working with what your performers bring as humans, and that's so crucial to the process. Sorry. But yeah, great idea.
Something I just thought of is that in the States recently, and I can't remember where it was, it might have been Chicago. Yeah, the mezzo-soprano Jamie Barton did a like a staged concert of Carmen she was in the title role, and Stephanie Blythe, who is a mezzo-soprano who is now singing very low, contralto, who is now singing some tenor roles. She sang Don José, and they made it a queer Carmen. It was a queer body positive Carmen. Yes, exactly. And the critic for the magazine didn't feel it worked. However, there was a great many people on social media who felt that it did, and who felt represented by this, who felt the story could be made to work in that way. So maybe it is up for grabs.
Fantastic. Well, you know, we're not going to get tired of her, however she manifests. I think you know, we put Sonia and Claire through the card song, through all the doom and the death. It's time to resurrect Carmen before we say goodnight. And thank you to everybody. Please, Claire, Sonia.
Thank you.